And welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity Podcast with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos. Guys, good to see you. Good. How you been?
We're doing well, Bill. Good to see you too.
Good to be here, Bill.
I'm excited about today's topic, maybe for different reasons than you are, but let's get into it. Because here in the States, President Trump has been very unhappy with the Federal Reserve Board, in particular with the Fed chairman, Mr. Powell.
No.
And he has been making all kinds of arguments about maybe I'm going to make an appointment of his successor sooner than usual. And there's been a lot of talk in the press and in the financial world about the central banks and whether we should lower, whether we should raise. And I've had friends of mine talking about the central bank. And John and Alex, one thing is true. There are a lot of people who seem to have a misunderstanding about the role of the central bank. So I was tickled when I looked at our notes today and saw, John, that you wanted to talk about what is the role of the central bank and what does it really do? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, John.
Its role is to create business cycles and recessions. That's what it does.
And thank you for listening to this podcast.
That wasn't its original mandate, but that's the end result.
Yeah.
Mr. Too Late might create another one, but we'll see how that evolves.
Yeah. So before, we could talk about this and make a lot of jokes about it, but let's start at the beginning. When was the central bank first created? This was not a constitutional item, obviously.
1791. Alexander Hamilton to create stability in the banking system, and the constitutionalists of the day. Here we are as Canadians giving American history. I thought that's an interesting observation.
It's financial history, John. It's financial history.
Yeah. How much of Canadian history do you know, Bill?
Well, I know that you're big on maple syrup up there, and that your last election you picked Mark Carney.
I didn't,
because Trump apparently didn't like him. So that's about it.
I didn't pick Carney. He wasn't my first choice. Anyway, 1791, first central bank. It didn't last because the constitutionalists felt it would support the elites in society, and that was contrary to the way the Constitution was written and the concept of the American society and its development. And so its charter expired after, I think, 20 years or so. Alex Alexander is an expert on U.S. history as well, probably because I have a passion for it, and he can elaborate with additional information as we roll through this. So feel free to jump in, Alexander. The second central bank was created in 1816, and Andrew Jackson didn't like it. He was also constitutionalist, so he wanted it to end, and so it eventually ended as well. It expired. I think it was a 20-year term.
Yeah, both of them were 20-year terms. So the first central bank was 1791 to 1811, and I want to say it was James Madison who did not renew its charter at that time, but then he actually instituted the second central bank, which started in 1816. Yeah. I believe that's the correct president at that time. He was the president during the War of 1812. So I believe I have my timelines correct there.
And then you had the Civil War in 1860 or so.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And that created cash flow issues and currency stability issues for the U.S. And so money flows were problematic, and there was a lot of panics in the 19th century with bank runs. And even if there was no justification for banks to have a panic because they were stable, because they were regional banks, rumors could develop and bring under a legitimate bank. So eventually, and I think the turning point was really Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan, and there was a bank run in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt just did not like the fact that J.P. Morgan had so much financial power, and he was determined to give the government that authority. So there was a push, obviously, in the early part of the 20th century to get it done, but it took 5 years of negotiation, bringing all the big financiers of the day onto a luxury resort on Jekyll Island, and they negotiated it to death. And in 1913, the current Federal Reserve System was created, which corrected some of the concerns of the original two banks, which were you didn't want to give too much power to the elites. So they created a system where you have 12 districts scattered around the country. And provided independence by restricting the president's authority and who's going to nominate to the board, and can only do one every 2 years, and then a rotation of people through the open market committee, et cetera. So some of the concerns about elitism were addressed in the structure. It became a far more adaptable system. That being said, there have been a lot of issues through the 20th century.
Yeah, that's fair. There have been a lot of issues. It's a nice broad statement. One could argue that perhaps there have been a lot of issues that have created that gave birth to a dynamic that I think is robust and healthy because it creates an argument. And there's been there's never a lack of opinion or in terms of discussing what the Fed is doing or not doing, or why they are or why they haven't done something, which, I mean, I would argue is important, particularly in an economy where just theoretically, like in government, there should be checks and powers. Mm-hmm. You know, the central bank provides a little check, a little bit of balance in terms of that flow of money within the economy. And that's not a bad thing, I would argue. Alex, you've been very quiet so far.
Well, I actually wanted to, before we get into the effectiveness of the central bank, and I think we should actually park that discussion until we delve a little bit more into how it operates. But
okay,
one thing I think that Dad, you should have elaborated on when you were going through it was what exactly is a bank run, because I don't think a lot of people today are probably not familiar with that term, because we haven't had a major bank run. I guess we had some last year in a small way in a regional capacity, but not on a largely national scale. And for those who aren't familiar, a bank run is when you have so banks don't keep 100% of their deposits on hand. So whatever your value of money that you place into the bank is, the bank does not keep 100% of that on hand to be able to pay out at a moment's notice. They have a reserve requirements that ranges depending on the type of bank. If I'm not mistaken, I believe nationally chartered banks have a 6% reserve ratio. Mm-hmm. And so they have to keep 6% of their deposits on hand to be able to pay out at any given time. Now, when you have a massive panic sit in, like you had over the course of about 50 years following the American Civil War, culminating with the Panic of 1907, what you had was people, anytime there was fear in the market, they would run to the bank and try and pull out all of their money. The bank obviously does not contain all of that cash on hand, and so it would essentially drive those regional banks into insolvency. And part of the creation of the central bank was to provide a backstop to essentially protect against a run on the bank, so that there was a system in place to provide enough liquidity to ensure that the banks remain solvent. Do you have something to contribute to that? I see you hemming and hawing over there.
Yeah, I do. Mr. Bailey Savings and Loan. It's a wonderful life.
I was just going to say, you took that right out of my mind, John. That's like the perfect example.
You said people don't know what a bank run is. If anyone watches It's a Wonderful Life, they know exactly what a bank run is.
Who the F is watching that movie? That movie's 400 years old.
But for those of you who
it's
listen to
a
this
classic.
Podcast, for those of you listening to the podcast who have not watched It's a Wonderful Life, if you want to see exactly what a bank run is
If
Go
you're
watch that
suicidal,
movie.
don't watch that movie. It'll make you slit your wrists.
No, it won't. It finished on
I'm
an
gonna have to put a
optimistic
warning
note.
on this podcast. Jesus.
Lionel Barrymore had a spectacular performance in that film.
There was a nasty old man in that movie.
But he played the role perfectly. He played it. And who doesn't like Charmer Stewart? Or is it wonderful?
We have some non-blue hairs who are listening to this podcast, Dad, so we need to keep them informed as well.
I think everyone of your
Well, the bank
generation
run,
needs to watch the movie.
But no, your point, Alex, a bank run is where people go in and say, I'd like my money now. And the bank goes, well, we only have part of your money. And they're like, I don't care. I want all of my money now.
You know what I find astonishing here at our local banks? Whenever I need a foreign currency, even the US dollar, they want notice. You came in and you requested $1,000 US. You don't have $1,000 US. You're a freaking bank. It's not like it's Russian rubles we're asking for. We're asking for US dollars.
Yeah, pretty common currency. They could have a fairly decent stockpile of it.
And if you say euro, good luck. Good luck. What euro? We need months to get that.
We need to call into Germany. We need to wire down there and get some cash. They need to bring it over in boats. So
when in my first career after graduating university, I worked at one of the major Canada's largest bank for 2 years at a branch, and I can tell you at that time the branches had far more authority in dealing with customers. Today, the branches they may as well be machines. They don't do anything. They don't authorize credit. It's all centralized. Everything's downtown. They don't want the people at the branch level to make any decisions whatsoever.
Right.
So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. So
Bailey Savings and Loans for everyone who didn't see the movie.
So that's what a bank run is for all of you below the age of 75.
It's a massive panic where people want their money right now and they can't get their money right now.
Yes.
And they drain the bank dry, and maybe 6% of the depositors get their money back and the 94% don't.
Yeah.
And it's an unhappy situation for everyone involved.
I think a lot of Canadians are not familiar with it because we haven't really had that experience here because of the nature of our banking system being very centralized. We have 6 major banks and arguably five really dominate. And you don't have mom and pop savings and loans and banks throughout the country as the U.S. does, although the U.S. has continued to centralize in
I was going to say, I get carried away because it's getting more central all the time.
Yeah, there are a handful. It's just that their prominence is nowhere near the same degree as exists in the United States. The prevalence of people who put their money into those regional savings and loans institutions is far lower. It's probably upwards of 95% of Canadians have their money within the big 5.
Yeah. And here, but in the U.S., I remember, Bill, I've been at this for 4 decades. I remember the savings and loan fiasco of the early 90s. And so it's, that's always been problematic. And there was, I think for a time, you couldn't have interstate commerce in the banking system. So you could not have a branch network outside the state.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that becomes problematic. And here in Canada, we've never had that issue. And I think so. So this is why Canadians probably are not familiar with the concept of
that's fair.
What a bank run is. But that's what a bank run is.
And Alex, I'm going to jump in here for 1 second, John. And Alex, just to finish that little piece of the conversation, how is a central bank supposed to prevent a bank run?
Lender of last resort.
Yeah, exactly.
So they provide the financial liquidity to the banks when they're having difficulty meeting the depositors' demands for cash. And so that is their principal role. And in the 20th century, in the second half of the 19th century, Mr. J.P. Morgan acted in that capacity and bailed out the U.S. financial system on 2 occasions. There was a bank run in the late 19th century as well as in 1907. So that's what really got under the skin of the progressives, which was a movement that was evolving in the early part of the 20th century and eventually created the central bank and created FDR. And we're not going to get into that topic.
Yeah, but the function of the lender of last resort, or maybe not the function is the wrong way to phrase it. The way in which the lender of last resort has operated has been different over time. So, similar where you had JP Morgan provide it in straight cash and
Right.
Here you go. We're going to provide some liquidity into the system so you guys can meet your withdrawal requirements. In different situations, we've seen it occur where the lender of last resort, like we saw during the 2008 financial crisis, they bought a whole bunch of the toxic assets that were on the books of the major financial institutions and basically provided them with the cash to then lend out, took those illiquid assets off of the books of the region or of the national banks, put it on the central bank's balance sheet, and then over a period of time collected whatever was able to be collected off of those bad loans and those bad assets and basically go ahead, Dad.
A good illustration as to one of the negative drawbacks of the central bank is taking private failure and giving it to the public taxpayer to pay
putting
for
it on the public debt.
Yeah.
Bingo.
And to the reason why people are probably out there asking why was that bad, because it was a very heavily debated topic at the time in 2008 whether or not it was appropriate for the central bank to step in and bail out those, and the government at large to step in and bail out some of those large institutions. And the reason why there was such a strong argument against doing it was because what it does is it creates moral hazard. Yeah, so you are encouraging the private institutions to take undue risk with the knowledge that there's a good chance that if they take enough of it and the risk is sufficiently spread out across the entire system, that if anything goes wrong, you will have the government there to step in and bail you out. So you won't actually feel the consequences of your malaction. And if enough of you are basically, if enough of you practice malpractice, I don't know a better way to phrase that, but
that's a good way to put it.
You are essentially encouraged to behave poorly as a group, so that way you don't miss out on the opportunity to get bailed out in the chance that that something goes wrong, like it did in 2008 when we had the housing market crash.
But there was also in that particular crisis the fact that the government of the day wanted banks to take on more risk. They were encouraging people who could not afford loans to go to their local banks, and those banks were instructed, make sure you lend the money. What was the CRA, or what was the system called, Bill? You're probably
I can't, I'm sitting here trying to remember, because I should remember, because I did a number of stories on the idea that you could walk in.
Community Reinvestment Act.
That's what that is. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So that was a policy, I think, that first came in the Clinton
it was
administration.
Yep.
Yeah. And later on, it was maintained by the Bush administration. And that was in hindsight in hindsight, I think people of a different political bias would have told you they should never have done that to begin with. The government should never interfere in private enterprise. They should just let private enterprise run their business the way they know how to run the business. And when you create distortions like the Community Reinvestment Act, you're asking for trouble.
You create bubbles is essentially what ends up happening. The free market will price in the risk associated with a particular lender or borrower into the price at which they're able to borrow and lend money at. So by artificially coming in and saying that you need to go and you need to lend to these people who are of a lower credit quality at essentially premium credit quality prices, and I'm talking about relatively lower interest rates, then what you do is you create valuation bubbles both in the real estate market and in the stock market, because then people are able to access liquidity that they wouldn't otherwise be able to, because they're being told, or the lending institutions are being told by the government that you need to provide these people with the opportunity to access money.
And that was a good discussion of something that happened recently, but going back to the Stone Age when Socrates and I used to hang out at a cafe in Athens. There was a savings and loan crisis in the early 1990s, and a lot of those small banks just went under, and that were allowed to go under, and it created a contraction in the money supply and a 2-year recession that lasted nearly 2 years at the time. But that paved the way for one of the best decades in U.S. economic history, the 1990s. And some people even today would argue that the '08 crisis and the way the government handled it, they probably should have allowed more of the private companies to go under than the ones that they did permit to go under, to clear out the bad and the malinvestment in the system. And I was one of those people who felt as though they should have allowed more failures take place, which would have been very painful economically in the short term.
Right.
But it really would have cleared the decks for greater prosperity going forward. Instead, what we've had is a zero interest rate policy for a decade afterward, and that creates its own problems. So,
not to mention a greater inflation of an already ballooning public debt.
And that's exactly it. So there's all this hand wringing in the public discussion forum regarding the gap between rich and poor. I would argue that the yo-yo interest rate policy of the central bank creates that gap, because what happens is when you
it exacerbates it makes it greater.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So when you cut interest rates to zero, savers get nothing on their bank deposits. Meanwhile, owners of assets in stocks and real estate benefit from the zero interest rate policy. So the people who have money now have more money. The people who have very little money stay there. And so that gap is created. Yeah, and that gap is exacerbated by that policy. So yeah, we get why they do it. They're trying to correct a problem, but they're creating a problem. They're correcting a problem they created to begin with.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to stop everybody because I feel like we're kind of getting sidetracked for a second here. Okay,
yes,
and I want to bring us back, because we need to understand precisely how the mechanism works. Because when we talk about controlling money supply, when we talk about we can talk about policy decisions by the Fed, but let's just talk on a daily. When people say, "Well, the Fed controls interest rates," I think that's the biggest misconception of all, because I don't think people understand the mechanism by which the Fed controls interest rates. And we were right there on the cusp of it, because it has to do with that window. Yeah, it has to do with that window to provide liquidity.
Yes. So let's break down the components of the bank.
Yeah.
Of the central bank, first of all. So we have the Board of Governors. We have the 12 Federal Reserve banks that are scattered across the United States.
Different regions, yep.
Yeah. So we have one in San Francisco. You have one in New York. You have actually two in Missouri, which is a compromise as part of the negotiation during the creation of the third charter of the central bank. And so you have one in St. Louis and Kansas City, both in Missouri there. But the New York central bank always has a seat. Permanent seat on the voting board. But anyway, so the Board of Governors is one, 12 Federal Reserve banks is two, and then the third component is the Federal Open Market Committee. And the Federal Open Market Committee is the component of the central bank that people are most familiar with.
Correct.
This is this is where Jerome Powell sits on that on the Federal Open Market Committee, and they make decisions on monetary policy. And the way that they do that is they can manage three different components. So they can manage the federal funds rate, which is the lending rate that exists between financial institutions. So when they say, the rate right now is, I'm on the spot, 4.25 or 4.5.
Or it's I think it's 4.25 to 4.5.
Yeah, so 4.5 is the rate.
Is the upper band.
Yeah, so the upper band is always what's quoted. So it's 4.5%. So the 4.5% is what is the rate of interest that financial institutions can charge each other whenever they lend money between themselves, and how that impacts the retail investor and businesses and consumers is because the rate that they are able to borrow and lend at is derived based on that that federal funds rate. So it is the federal funds rate is what's given to the institutions, and then there's a markup and a markup and a markup that goes to retail investors, that goes to businesses, that goes to consumers. So that is the foundation or the bedrock of the interest rates that exist within the economy. The other way that they can manage the money supply are through two other mechanisms. The reserve requirement, which, as I explained before, is how much cash must be kept on reserve.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a higher reserve requirement, that means that the banks have less money available to lend out, which means that the money supply is lowered, interest rates increase, and economic activity gets restricted. Same thing with the open market operations, and that's what happened in 2008 with the quantitative easing. So you have the ability to quantitative easing is a slightly different concept, but open market operations are essentially the buying and selling of treasury bonds, which are 10 to 30-year terms, to increase or reduce the money supply. So when you buy treasury bonds, they are injecting money into the economy, because that's money that goes out into the market and into the hands of investors, who can then turn around and either reinvest that money into other companies, or they can turn around and they can spend it for consumption purposes. Conversely, if they go out and they sell treasury bonds, so they're issuing bonds and they take cash back in return, they are taking money out of the economy. They are reducing the supply of money, which will then raise interest rates and once again restrict economic activity. And so those are the ways in which the money supply operates.
And I think this is where we're going to get into where I think one of the big areas of misconceptions happens, because they think that the fundamental control of money rests with the Fed. And the Fed does not have fundamental control of the money. Congress, which spends money, has the fundamental control of money. So it is government spending, whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a libertarian or whatever, independent. When the government is putting more money into the market, they're creating a greater amount of money supply, which is the fundamental part of the equation of the thing we call inflation. Am I right here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what you're referring to is fiscal policy. What I was referring to was monetary policy, which is a component of money supply. The other component, the other half of that, as you mentioned, and you could argue the more impactful half, because it is a little bit more subjective, is fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxation. So taxation is the revenue generator for the government, and the government expenditures is the as it stated, the expenditure side of that ledger. And so when the government increases spending for things like welfare, infrastructure, public-private partnerships, those are all opportunities to inject money supply into the economy. Now, you can argue when it goes into a value-creating entity that there is a balancing effect that happens, but when it is purely a printing of money and a handout of checks, that is a vastly inflationary tactic and a vastly inflationary behavior. To give people an example of that would be during the COVID, during the pandemic, when they were sending out relief checks to everybody. That's money that essentially the government has printed and just artificially created and added to the system. There's been no new creation of goods and services as a result of that money going into the economy. All that's happened is you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, which is what creates inflation. It creates prices to go higher because people say, well, I now have, instead of, I have, I need to buy socks. And socks, there are 10 socks. I have $10. So the price of socks is $1 per sock. So there's $10 in the economy and there's 10 socks. So the price of socks is $1 per pair of socks. If you now have $20 in the economy, but still only 10 socks, the price is going to go up to $2. Because somebody's going to say, well, if he's only willing to pay you $1, I'll pay you $1.10 to make sure I get that pair of socks. And then it goes up and up and up until we reach the equilibrium point of $2 per pair of socks.
I hope those socks are made of cotton at that price.
I would doubt it.
None of this nylon stuff, fake petroleum-made clothing.
Well, at $2 per pair, I'm going to tell you, probably synthetic.
And Alexander, people weren't buying extra socks; they were buying gym equipment.
Yes, I know that. So the reason why I use socks is because when I studied in university, they always give the example of the sock economy, and that's the sock market, not the stock market, the sock market. And that's how they explain supply and demand in first year economics at the University of Toronto.
Touching on, Alex, you're basically describing inflation. What's the difference between inflation in a market and hyperinflation?
Well, inflation in a market, so we always have some level of inflation in the market, or at least we have created a neutral level of inflation within the market. And we'll get into why, Dad, you can get into why that exists. But essentially, inflation is a relative that we have targeted is about 2% per year. And so that is considered the neutral inflation rate. Hyperinflation is when we have inflation that exceeds 2%. I don't know. I don't remember the exact threshold that they quantify hyperinflation. Is it 20%?
I'm not sure.
Or 10% is the threshold?
I don't know what the threshold is, but obviously something
in excess of the neutral rate.
Excess of anything beyond 10% is, in my view, hyperinflation. But to make it simple for people of today, the difference between inflation is the difference between Joe Biden and Erdogan in Turkey. So Erdogan in Turkey had hyperinflation, and Biden in the US just had regular high inflation.
Well, I think the best example of hyperinflation is what happened in Germany in the 1920s. I think that's the most visible example of hyperinflation.
I think it was the 30s, wasn't it?
No, it was the 20s. It was before
the lead up to the war.
Yeah, but so it happened in the 1920s because it was the immediate following of World War I. It was the reparations that were being made to all the other European countries for the damage that they did in Europe during the First World War. And basically what the German government did is they inflated their currency. They printed more money in order to try and inflate away the debt. And they created hyperinflation. I recall in the neighborhood of 27% in order to try and inflate away the debt, because they couldn't afford to pay the amount of money that they owed to the rest of the world, as well as repay the cost of actually financing the war, because they had to spend a lot of money on materials and armaments and whatnot.
The famous image of the hyperinflation of in Germany was the fact that people had to go with wheelbarrows full of German marks to buy a loaf of bread.
And they would burn the cash. It was actually more cost effective for them to burn the cash than to buy wood to heat their homes. So they would just throw the cash into their oven, the furnace, and they would, picture a black, wood burning
You want to
furnace.
talk about hyperinflation? Here's a current example of hyperinflation from the, I don't recall if it was the 80s or the 90s, but in South America, and I think Argentina specifically, at the department stores, when you walked into a department store to buy an item, you would pick it up, and there was a big electronic board at the end of the store on the wall that had the price for every item in the store. As you picked up the item and you walked to the cashier, the price would rise.
Yeah.
That's how high the inflation was in Argentina at that point. Think about that for a second. You pick up an item, pick up the sock, and it's 10 Argentinian pesos. By the time you walk to the cashier, it's 20 Argentinian pesos. So imagine that. That's the insanity of governments that are out of control, that print too much money for the amount of goods in society.
In Germany in the 20s, they had to pay people twice per day because that's how fast the inflation was occurring. The prices were rising. It was, and it's a toxic spiral to get into.
So the opposite of that is deflation.
Yes.
And that is when the value, the price of goods actually declines. And people intuitively would say, oh, that's a good thing. I want prices to go down. But here's what happens with deflation. And we saw this in the 1930s. You need to buy something new, like let's say a car. And you say, well, prices are going down. I'm not going to get the car today. I'll just put off the purchase for another 6 months. And so the people who are producing the cars have to start laying off their employees because the demand for their product is diminishing. And so that's the negative of deflation and the negative aspect of deflation. So you don't want deflation. So what the central banks have determined is that an inflation rate somewhere between 0 and 2%, and they say they target 2%, but as long as it falls within that range, as long as it's positive and low, there is sufficient incentive for people to buy goods today and avoid postponing the purchase into the future. And that keeps the economy moving. And that's why we have a small amount, or the objective is to have a small amount of inflation. But it's precisely the effects of inflation why people need to invest money. Now, you talk about people having cash under their mattresses in the Great Depression, but in an inflationary world, there's very little incentive to have money in a bank deposit, especially if it's paying anything under 5%, because after taxes and inflation, your
real return is basically zero.
You're spinning your wheels. You're spinning your wheels. You're not increasing your purchasing power. So the reason people invest, whether it's in stocks or real estate, is to increase their purchasing power. And so the inflation is the ongoing incentivization for people to get their money to grow.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the central bank, and the two primary objectives of the central bank are to, number one, manage inflation and stabilize prices in the economy, so to try and defend that 2% inflation rate, and number two is to maximize employment.
Now, that's a uniquely American central bank mandate. Canada does not have that mandate, and most central banks around the world don't have that mandate.
Canada does not have it explicitly, but they essentially operate towards that mandate anyway. They are cognizant of
they're tied. Inevitably, they're tied together, right? Yeah. But in the U.S., there's an explicit determination.
It is documented as the foundational objectives of or primary objectives of the federal bank, or the Federal Reserve, I should say.
Yeah. It's interesting. I did not realize, but I can't imagine a central bank not operate, whether it's a mandate or not. I can't imagine a central bank not operating on that principle.
Well, Bill, when I went to school in the ancient times, where we chipped our notes on tablets, we were the agreement in the economics class was that full employment, which was achieved at 6 to 6.5%.
Yes.
And today, as we clearly see, unemployment, the rate of unemployment can dip down significantly below that, down to 3%. So, what is full employment? The goalposts keep moving on that target.
Well, and even then, technically, the unemployment rate that we are quoted is not really truly reflective of what the total level of potentially employed individuals is, because what are classified as discouraged workers in the economy are not included in that rate. So people who are not actively seeking work essentially are not included in the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate only captures the people who are of the age and able and ability to work, but are actively seeking employment and not able to find it. Whereas those who are not actively seeking employment and are able to work are not included in that number. And so the more all-encompassing number, I believe, is called the R8 measure. If I'm not mistaken.
How do we classify the bureaucrats who work from home from a bathtub?
We classify them as technically employed, but otherwise known as leeches on society. If we have any public sector listeners right now, they've given us a thumbs down on Spotify and YouTube.
People think that we're making fun and joking, but that's an actual fact. That
is a fact.
Yeah,
it's affecting. I know it's affecting the United States. What I'm laughing at is it's also a fact in Canada. I probably shouldn't be laughing about any of that.
But the whole bathtub thing was actually documented as I was a government employee in the U.S. who was saying he was working, but he has pictures of himself in a bathtub while he's working. I don't know how laptops can sit on your lap.
I mean, this is way off topic, but, it reminds me of the story back in the Depression of the preachers who used to do their radio sermons from bathtubs while drinking gin. Yeah. So it's apparently a time-honored tradition, as a matter of fact.
Bill, you remember that?
John,
How old were you?
I had to buy my own rock tablet to take the class. Okay.
Oh, we had the largest of the government giving us our tablets.
Oh gosh. Well, how do we want to wrap this up? Because there are a lot of ways we could go and a lot of places we could go.
Well, I think the best way to wrap this up is to circle back to our initial discussion that was posited at the beginning, which is, has the central bank successfully achieved its stated goals?
And it's been a mixed bag in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want us to answer that question now or after the break?
You tell me, because
I think we've got about 5 minutes. We can.
Okay. All right. So I think one of the objectives of the central bank was to stop bank runs. And I think that that objective has been achieved. As to preventing market panics or financial panics, well, financial panics are not in the form of bank runs in the 20th century and the 21st century, but they're in the form of business cycles, expansions, contractions, and recessions, et cetera. And from that perspective, the central bank has not reduced those. They've actually increased the frequency of that. And the Great Depression was in fact caused by the central bank, contrary to what the school system has taught everyone, that it was the unfettered
greed
in free market capitalism that caused the market crash.
Oh, it was remember Wall Street. Greed is good. God, I love Michael Douglas.
It's a classic line. Anyway, so back in those days, that the central bank cut interest rates. Sorry, increased interest rates. They cut the money. They cut the money supply in the late 1920s. That eventually triggered the collapse in the stock market. And then in the early 1930s, they did not fulfill their role as lender of last resort, and a lot of banks went bankrupt. And that created that extended the recession by a significant number of years, and then the U.S. went, not just the U.S. but Canada as well, went in and out of recession, depression for 10 years. So, the government of the day and the central bank of the day inadvertently took what should have been an 18-month recession and turned it into a 14-year depression. And so on that basis, the first test of the newly created third central bank in the United States was a failure. And in fact, and if people want to argue with me, they can't, because Ben Bernanke admitted, I think it was in 2002, at a party to celebrate Milton Friedman, who wrote that the central bank was responsible for the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke said at the party in a public forum, Milton, you're correct. We did it. We're sorry. And I'll make sure we don't do it again.
Ben. If only that were true.
Ben, that's the same Ben that said, what housing crisis? There's no housing crisis.
Exactly.
In 2008.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't see a problem on the horizon.
But yeah, exactly. And Jay Powell, it's transitory inflation.
Yeah, Mr. Too Late himself.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing I was going to say, two other things I was going to say, to circle back to our previous series that we did on market crises, every single recession that has occurred over the last 150 years has followed a shock to the money supply, which, as we've outlined here, is largely controlled by the Federal Reserve and the central bank
since 1913.
Yes. So to say to determine the level of success that they have had is, as you said, a mixed bag. We have successfully avoided things like bank runs, and we've created and established more confidence in the financial institutions and the financial sector. But there is also a downside that is not, I don't think, properly quantified or properly appreciated by the average person. I don't think the average person fully understands the degree to which they say, "Oh, soft landing. We've got a soft landing. Everything's great." Is it? How do we don't know the counterfactual? We don't know how much faster the economy may have rebounded if we had allowed it to naturally go through its cycle.
Alexander, for the uninitiated, you need to elaborate on what a soft landing is.
Go ahead.
What does that mean? So when the economy is overheated and the central bank raises interest rates to contract the money supply, their objective is to allow to have that process take place on very gradually, so the economy slows down and is no longer overheated, but doesn't actually contract. So it grows, but at a slower pace. And achieving that from an overheated economy to get it to a neutral place is considered a soft landing. And then you'll have economists arguing that the Fed has not achieved a soft landing successfully more than maybe once in its history. But that's a subject for another day.
Yeah, let's turn it back over to Bill here to wrap up, and we'll discuss and you can tease the next topic that we're going to discuss here, Bill.
Yeah, no, this is great. And this is a good point to wrap it up, because we could have an even longer discussion about this if we really were going to let ourselves go here. I guess two things here. One, it's important that if people are listening to this conversation and they're not clients of yours, they should know that they can reach out and have a conversation with you. I know the contact information and everything are in the show notes, but Alex or John, really quickly, if someone wants to reach out to you and have a conversation, what's the best way for them to do it?
Best way is for them to visit our website at medwealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca.
Great. The other thing you can do, by the way, is really simple. If you're not a subscriber already, hit follow. The reason you should do that is when you become a subscriber, you will be notified every time a new episode of this podcast drops, and you can give it a listen. I would also ask, if you like the podcast, you find it entertaining, you find it informative, share it with people, tell people about it. Word of mouth promotion is really, really welcome, especially in this world where who knows what is recommending what to you on the internet. Something from somebody you know is always a lot better.
Just remember, Blue Horseshoe loves Anacott Steel.
Ooh, what's going on here? Well, is that going to be in our next episode?
Probably not.
Yeah,
what is going to be in our next episode?
That's in the third installment of Wall Street.
Yeah. I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to show up, and they're going to have a Canadian to reckon with. It's not just going to be Charlie Sheen snorting some powder.
The third installment is going to be Wall Street Final Reckoning.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yes.
There is no final reckoning for Wall Street. None, unfortunately. But that's a topic for another podcast. What are we getting to in our next podcast, guys? What's coming up next?
Well, we're going to get into the backing of currency, fiat money, and the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. It's a topic that has been discussed at length over the last, who even knows how many years now, whether there's going to be another currency that is going to step up and replace the U.S. dollar as a world reserve currency, and we're going to get into that topic.
It's going to be the Greek drachma, just letting everyone know in anticipation.
Which hasn't existed for 20 years.
Don't give it away. Don't give it away. So be sure that's the best reason. Hit the follow button, because when that one comes out, you can get notified about that as well. So you can give it a listen. Until then, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of John and Alex and everybody at Med Wealth Management. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.